who have you interviewed that's been most popular?
Noam Chomsky, and you're one of the reasons why, because I was the first person, if not the only person, to ask him about you directly.
Uh-oh. So I don't know about that. So there's something we could talk about right away. So what did he have to say?
Well, essentially, you're Hitler.
He said, essentially, you're Hitler. Somebody told me that same exact thing in an email, a long email. And I have yet to see anything about Jordan Peterson that will say that this dude is Hitler. But again, I gotta completely know. Okay, yeah, this. Okay.
As you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
so why do you think he thinks that?
I think that people who are on a certain side on the political spectrum believe their side stands for what's good, and the opposite side is what's not good. See, that's so tricky, man. Talking about better left and center, which we'll get to later, is how do you define the left and the right? It's decidedly difficult. Almost everyone has a different definition. Chomsky would say, well, the left is freedom. And so anything that's on the right is anti-freedom. And the right, people who are on the right or identify with being as such, would perhaps categorize it as the opposite.
Yeah, well, it's interesting at least that they might circle around claims to some let's say, virtue that both of them would admire, like freedom. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's some agreement there, despite the difference. Did he point to anything particular about what I hypothetically thought that made me not an acceptable sort of creature?
Yeah, and I'm glad that see, you can tell that Jordan Peterson is a psychologist of some sort, because he makes sure before he starts to really talk about a certain thing, he need to fully understand complete context, especially since the gentleman is not there. So tell me what how he felt about me. Okay, all right, and can you tell me exactly what made him come up with that conclusion? All right, and any other follow-up questions that he's going to ask, and then more than likely after that he's going to tear him apart, because that's what he do, because he's smart. His IQ is just crazy.
No, it's somewhat hearsay in the sense that he read an article based on you. So he didn't watch you directly. He read Nathan Robinson's critique of you, which I'm sure you've heard.
Yeah, well, that'll do it, man. Yeah, old Nathan. Yeah. He's quite the character. Yeah, I see. So, well, that's too bad.
You can't judge anybody off of hearsay or somebody else's critique on you. What the heck? Like, seriously. I hope nobody's looking inside of my comment section like before they even watch the video, because they would hate me compared to with some of the things that y'all say inside the comment section. They will probably hate me. They will look in there and they be like, first of all, you need to pay attention more. You need to listen more. You need to do this. You need to do that. Without even giving me a chance. That's not cool. Nah, never judge anybody by third party. Like, that's just ridiculous. Also, if y'all like this type of content, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Also, the notification bell, so that next time we post some content, you'll be the first to be notified. And if you want to hear some music and other types of, we got a whole bunch of other types of reactions going on the LFR Family Plus channel.
Many regards. Did you learn anything in particular from talking to Dr. Chomsky?
Quite a significant amount. As for what I can point to, let me think. I spoke to him 6 times. 6 times on the channel. So the first time about you, I found it interesting that he said, I asked each guest that I spoke to at the time, because now I've pivoted away from politics for reasons we can get to later. I asked him and every other guest, when does the left go too far? In some sense, it's a Petersonian question, because you've raised that quite a few times. When does the left go too far? He said, well, it's not a matter of going too far for the left. It's a matter of tactics. As for when does the right go too far? He said, well, the right is suicidal, I think was his words.
So that's interesting, because it's really not much of an answer. I mean, I've been always looking for a technical definition of that, right? It's like, well, we know the right can go too far and we know the left can go too far. Yeah. And how do we point to and I think this problem has actually become more complicated rather than less, because the more I've been thinking about it, the more I think that the errors on the left are more in the nature of a vast number of small errors, often of omission. So the more reasonable people on the left kowtow too rapidly to the more radical types on the left, especially at the philosophical level. And I think that really happened at the universities. So,
well, that's something we can explore. Well, it's actually a question I would have for you. Why do you think that is? I know that this is mainly you interviewing me, but I'm still perplexed when it comes to that. Why is it that the center left doesn't excoriate the extreme left? Is it because they're on the same side, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Or are they afraid because, well, you can lose even a tenured position?
Well, I think that fear, and it isn't obvious to me that this is merely a problem that affects the left, but I'm most familiar with it in the university circumstance. And so what I saw happening in my 25 years as a faculty member, let's say, I think that's about right. It's more than that, actually. But anyways, quite a long time, 3 decades, let's say, was that whenever the administration pushed on the faculty, so in our faculty meetings, for example, there would be administrative demands, and they were often unreasonable. They would increase the size of our seminars, say, for our 3rd and 4th year students, ask us to do more work with fewer resources. And that was a steady trend. Like if you look at spending, say, on faculty salaries versus spending on administrative salaries across universities in the West, broadly speaking, but certainly in North America, the amount spent on administration just skyrocketed upward, whereas the amount spent on faculty pretty much stayed constant.
I did not know that they did that to people inside of, they did that to actual professors at universities. I honestly didn't know that. I thought, yeah, they did it to teachers who was teaching in elementary school. Yes, they were doing it to teachers who was teaching in public schools up to 12th grade, but not in universities. I did not know that. This is new to me. All right.
Just skyrocketed upward, whereas the amount spent on faculty pretty much stayed constant. And so why? Well, it was because the faculty just retreated continually every time they were challenged to say no. And so I objected repeatedly in faculty meetings whenever that happened and said, well, why don't we just say no? They want to increase our seminar size, like double it, let's say, for 3rd years. That's not a seminar anymore once you get to a certain point. We just say, no, we're not doing that. Why don't we just say no? We won't do that. Well, then they won't give us what we want. Well, they don't give you what you want anyways. So what's to lose? And but so it was 1,000 tiny retreats. And then what happened after that was that the administration, having grown too top heavy, was taken over by people within the administration, let's say, who had this DEI philosophy, and they couldn't say no to them. So when did the left go too far? Well, it was micro retreats, continual cowardly micro retreats at the university level. Now, sorry to be so long-winded about this, but there was something more brutal underneath all that philosophically, which I'm trying to lay out in a new book that I'm writing, which is this postmodern problem. And the postmodern problem really emerged in the 1960s with the simultaneous realization across a number of disciplines that there's almost an infinite number of ways of perceiving anything. And I mean literally perceiving. So when you look at the world, you see these things you think are objects, and they're sort of self-evident. But where an object begins and where it ends is much more difficult to compute than anyone ever realized, which is partly why we don't have, robots wandering around doing things like dishwashing, which turns out to be insanely complex. And it also emerged in literary criticism with the realization that, well, just as there were an indefinite number of ways of looking at something, so actually acquiring the objective facts of perception, there was an even more vaguely indefinable way of potentially interpreting a text or a canon of texts, let's say. So how do we decide what's good and what's bad literature, what's deep and what's shallow, what's valid and invalid? And the answer is, we don't know. That's the answer. But a premature answer was generated by social critics on the left. And the premature answer was, well, all our categories and the active categorization itself serve the will to power. And that's true to some degree, because we're all totalitarian and authoritarian and narcissistic to some degree. We also use deception to get what we want. So we can corrupt our category structure. But there's a huge difference between saying, well, we don't know the answer, but power may play a role, and saying the answer is that power always plays a role and that's all there is.
Let me tell you something, man. Mr. Peterson is Jordan Peterson is one of the realest there is out there that I've heard so far. I've checked out a few. He seemed like he backs values. He backs certain values. That's what he do. He backs it 100%. But he attempts as much as he possibly can to be fair. But it seems like he's more so trying to do the smartest thing, the most effective thing, and where not many people are hurt by doing it. And he want to make sure that people hold themselves accountable and use a bit of common sense. Like he said, if the school system is all, if the part of the government that's supposed to be funding us and they aren't giving you the money that you're supposed to be using for the school, then guess what? You now have the right to do what's right for the school at large, but people still make the scared decision, like they make the safe decision. And you don't always have to be so safe, especially if you're already getting they're penny pinching every single year, and the amount of money that you're getting to use is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. This dude is smart as heck. He's very patient, and I like how he gets to the meat of it all, and then breaks it down. Man, it's like, for me to just sit here and listen without taking notes is foolish. This is actually foolish. I'm just doing first listens. I should have a notebook but I don't want to prolong this video for you all.
And saying the answer is that power always plays a role and that's all there is. And that's what's happened on the left in the postmodern field. And that sort of fit in nicely with the idea that capitalism was essentially oppressive, and that the patriarchal structure is essentially oppressive, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an unbelievably corrosive and terrible philosophy. So, well, the left went too far there to claim that nothing but the will to power governs categorization, and the active categorization, which is basically consciousness itself, that active categorization, that you could not possibly formulate a more cynical, malevolent, and careless, destructive philosophy. So,
see what makes this. So you interpreted the question as a time question, temporal one. When does the left go too far? And I guess that's within when. And for me, what you also laid out ideologically, what it is that they believe that makes them go too far. I don't like to use the word ideological. We don't have to get into the reasons there, but for the sake of speaking right now, I'll just use that word. When do they go too far ideologically? See, some of the people I spoke to said the left goes too far when it comes to violence. Well, there's something that leads to the violence, some idea. And you also mentioned power.
Right, yes, that also doesn't distinguish the left going too far from the right going too far, right? So, and it's not a really good answer, because sometimes we think that violence is justified, like in self-defense, and so often political violence is, what would you say, rationalized, and sometimes perhaps even functions as self-defense. And sometimes it's rebellion against true oppression, in which case people on the left and the right might regard violence not only as necessary, but actually morally demanded, right? Ethically demanded. So the mere use of violence, and then, of course, what constitutes violence, that's the next problem with that. It's too shallow an argument to really get to the core of things.
One has to be extremely careful about what counts as self-defense, especially preemptive self-defense, which is behind much of what they do. They'll say that, well, we have to take action now against the right or the extreme right, which pretty much everyone who is on the right, they would classify as being a part of the alt-right or alt-light.
Yeah, well, that's another part. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's another part of this tit-for-tat process that we see, I think, perhaps accelerating it, particularly in the United States with the return of Trump, let's say, to the political arena. And there's a tremendous amount of distrust, growing distrust on both sides of the political spectrum, driven, well, that's the question, driven by what? Certainly by the extreme views of a minority on both sides, laying out the exact...
By the extreme views by the minority, it's just a little bit of people on both sides.
Causal process is extremely difficult because these things, they're not unidirectionally causal, right? They cause, each causes the other. You know, I poke you, you poke me, I slap you, you slap me a little harder, I punch you, you punch me, you know, and then we have knives and we're at each other's throats and we say, well, you know, who started it? Well, maybe you said something insulting before I poked you, you know, but one of the things of interest when observing something like that is the causal process that's involved in the tit for tat return. And I've been thinking about that a lot because for a whole variety of reasons that I can't go into. But Jonathan Haidt also just wrote an article about positive feedback loop processes operating at a very rapid scale on Facebook and Twitter and exacerbating this political positive feedback loop, right? A runaway positive feedback loop. You know, if you're doing any recording and you bring your microphone too close to the speaker that you're speaking through, you'll get this howl of feedback, and that can destroy the whole system, the whole recording system. And that's a good example of how a positive feedback loop can get out of control. And that's the real enemy. Like, if we're thinking meta-politically, the real enemy is the possibility that mutual distrust on both sides will accelerate our descent into a kind of melee. And so the enemy isn't necessarily...
I love that. And then when that happens, the truth becomes mush. It's like we know that both sides are probably coming from a very good place. But because of the distrust and the and the strategic conversations, everything's a debate. I don't want to be objective because if I say the wrong thing, you might use it against me. If you say the wrong thing, I'm going to use it against you. It's like the trust isn't there, so the transparency isn't there, and like unless you catch me in a lie or you ask me flat out, you're not going to get the truth, and it messes things all up. And it slows down the process of getting things done. Like you said, it's just a minority of people on both sides, but those minorities are usually the loudest. And that's why we end up seeing those things highlighted all over the news. Because the minority parts are loud, bro. They're loud.
The catastrophic ideology of the left or the right, but the manner in which extreme views can foster a spiral of violence that none of us know how to stop. There
you go. I really enjoyed that. Hopefully you guys did too. Please let me know what y'all thought about this in the comments below. If you have yet to hit that subscribe button, please do so on your way out the door. Once again, guys, I am Van, and now we are all the LFR family. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video, hopefully inside the Patreon as well. The last couple of videos I've done were directly from supporters of the channel who sent me messages. And yeah, so that's what I did tonight. So I look forward to seeing y'all again. Thank you again for clicking play. Y'all take care of each other. I love y'all. Perpetrate, cause this 38 will be designated for all those that hate it like just man, I'm contemplating. Your moves you lose, now your hot you gave me new moves, more dudes, now the top you made me same rules, new